So this is actually some of my strongest memories of my days in Florida. I think you guys are blessed with one of the best places to study law. We were talking before the gathering today, and recalling to my friends my long swings in the Gulf back in the day, side by side with the Dolphins. I mean, there's nothing to inspire you more to go back and get into the boats than go out and actually living and experience in Florida's nature. So I didn't have the great environmental law background when I left here, but I did have a great foundation in law and litigation. Got to do a clerkship with a federal judge in Jacksonville. Worked at a law firm for about 5.5 years up there. And ultimately, I came full circle around to representing Florida's wildlife. Several of my partners in crime here today, David White, Tom Reeves, Laurie McDonald, I got to represent the Florida panther, and Florida snailkite, the loggerhead sea turtle, and the Florida key deer. We're going to talk a little bit later. And so obviously, being here at Stetson had an impact. I felt a certain obligation to come back and help out. Another way I've come full circle is my first legal job was just a mile or so away here working for Ed Foreman. And what a treat to come back and to see Bonnie, who I met back in the mid-1980s. And, obviously there was a calling. Ed helped lay that foundation to set me up. And I had no idea the strong passion in their family for conservation. But obviously they had an impact on me as well, and I'm really grateful for that as well. So what a treat to be here. I want to get right into the substance. I was able to now, pump you up with all those good feelings, and I'm going to talk about climate change. You have been, I hope, to a lot of good lectures on all the intricacies of the way climate change is changing our lives. I want to start with this picture of this woman from Tuvalu, an island in the southern Pacific Ocean, and really just focus on the words on her sign, just for a moment. Because we live in this very strange media vortex here in the United States where climate change has essentially become a political football and it's sort of an abstraction. That is not the case in Tuvalu. Their very existence, their very survival is basically in doubt now as a result of sea level rise. I want to focus on the word prepare. That's really the focus of this overall talk today. They are preparing to have to move out of their home and essentially lose their island to sea level rise. That's a virtual inevitability. The other part I want to focus on that side is rest of the world. This concept of climate change adaptation is so enormous. The idea that any one small, poor country is going to get themselves out of the box of climate change is a ridiculous notion in my mind. In fact, the notion that any individual by themselves could really make a difference on this, acting alone, is absurd, right? So the other question is, what is the solution? And it's going to take a level of collective action and leadership from government, private sector, universities, NGOs, that is virtually unprecedented. And that's what I want to talk about here, mainly sort of talk about what that action agenda might be. I'm not going to go through all of the impacts of climate change. We don't have time here for today. So the main focus of my talk today is floods and storms. So we've been hit what I would call a triple whammy. And southern Florida in particular is feeling the effects of sea level rise, intensified tropical storms, and intensified heavy rainfall events. Each of them, again, getting out of this world of abstraction, let's just talk about what is here. Maybe you're somebody who's confused by climate modeling and doesn't want to look at what's happening 2050, 2100. Let's just talk about it right now. We've already experienced in South Florida 9 inches of sea level rise. And by the way, sea level rise is relative. It has everything to do with how much the land is rising and sinking. So I'm going to use some averages here. I always have to oversimplify a little bit just to get through these facts. And so the Army Corps of Engineers, using some very conservative projections, says 1 to 2 additional feet by 2060. And that doesn't require a lot of fancy climate modeling. There's this basic concept of thermal expansion. As the world warms, so does the ocean expand. It's a pretty basic concept of physics, been around for centuries. And then what makes the numbers really go off the charts is when you start factoring in the melting of Greenland ice sheets and other land ice. Tropical storms, again, no question that the southern Atlantic, where tropical storms originate, is warming, and that adding more heat into that system adds more energy. That makes more intense tropical storms. So it's not a highly debated point of climate change science to say we're going to get more frequent and intense tropical storms out of southern Atlantic. And finally, heavy rainfall events, and that's really not linked to tropical storms. Basically, all rainfall events become more intense because the warming atmosphere holds more water vapor. And that's, again, a law of physics that has been around for a long time. So I'm here to talk about concepts that in the scientific community are really not debatable. And you put all three of those together, they have this synergistic effect of ever-worsening floods, and particularly for those who live on the coast. Think about every single coastal storm you have going forward, marching a little farther inland every single time. And that's because sea level rise is a steady, gradual phenomenon. And so the Hurricane Sandy of this year, exact same force of storm, will march in several meters further inland next year and further. So, and in a place like Florida, obviously, that has its freshwater supplies right beneath the surface, that issue of saltwater intrusion has got to be front and center. So I'm going to go right to the conversation about solutions. I know if you're like me, you go to a lot of climate change lectures and you just get whooped out of the side of the head one time after another by one more scary fact. And I'm trying to get right into the business of talking about what we're going to do about it. So let's talk about this notion of green infrastructure, which is a jargon term. I don't know how much you've all been exposed to it, so I'm going to try to put it in the most basic term concept. Oyster reefs. Large part of our coast, we're actually surrounded by oyster reefs historically, and they are some of the best ways of absorbing wave energy, the impacts of coastal storms. Coastal wetlands and dunes, replanting vegetated dunes. These are all some fairly low-tech, inexpensive ways to protect communities from floods and storms. Once you get off the coast, anywhere that's in a floodplain, if you want to look at maps of floodplains, you'll see how extensive floodplains actually are. There's a lot we can do by essentially protecting natural lands or semi-natural lands, or farms or ranches, that sort of thing, and limiting the impervious surfaces so you get more absorption of those floodwaters. And finally, in the more heavily urbanized environments, there's a lot we can do, what I would call using nature's processes and trying to replicate things like water filtration and absorbing the heat island effect by essentially planting lots of trees, roof gardens, and swales, and essentially revegetating our urban communities. Very low-tech, inexpensive thing we can be doing right now to help adapt to climate change. And this, to me, is so commonsensical. Then I put my policy hat on and I say, wait a second, this is actually not the policy of the United States, nor is it the policy of most states. We're starting to make progress. I'm going to talk about some of the areas of progress, but let's just talk about what the norm is in this country. And I call it, just to oversimplify the notion, great infrastructure. And we're talking about seawalls, we're talking about levees, dikes, river training structures, basically all these higher tech, more expensive solutions to try to absorb floods and storms, and address floods and storms. So here you have a picture of your classic seawall operation here. And on the lower right is a picture of one of my favorite cities, Seattle. That's SeaTac Airport, actually, after one of their normal rainstorms. So some of the key points I want to make about great infrastructure is a lot of these devices are sold to people as facilitating development in some of those most beautiful places to live, right on the coast and right on the riverside. And in fact, those protections are oftentimes, and now again generalizing here, there are times when hard infrastructure, great infrastructure solutions are necessary and important. But oftentimes they are sold, they're oversold. They're providing illusory protections so somebody can develop in those places that look like great places to live. And oftentimes they don't get the key data laid out by those developers in terms of what the risks are. So you get a lot of unwise development. What you also have is one neighbor shifting its risk to their next door neighbors or their downstream neighbors. So if you put up a seawall or you put up any kind of structure along a river, push the water away, where is it going to go? It's going to go to your neighbors. And so it's really not a question of protecting a community. Sometimes it's somebody protecting themselves will be expensive to the community. And then there's a larger phenomenon. Most communities don't really have any regulatory structure in place to sort of keep track of or to limit the amount of impervious surface in their community. And so there's a certain tipping point you hit when you get too much impervious surface where you essentially heat up the floodwaters, you accelerate the movement of floodwaters, and you do serious damage to aquatic ecosystems. So So that is our land use policy, our flood management policy. Oversimplifies and overgeneralizes. That's the majority approach in terms of where most of the policy, most of the spending goes in terms of how we address floods. It's putting up those hard walls and barriers and trying to pretend that that's going to get us out of this jam. And one of the reasons why somebody like me who spends so much time on this is, as a general rule of thumb, again, I'm having to generalize here, those approaches are oftentimes very bad for wildlife. And so that picture up in the top right, courtesy of the Sea Turtle Conservancy, is a loggerhead sea turtle tracks, and that's a mother sea turtle looking for a place to lay her eggs. And those seawalls typically discourage successful nesting, and it's a major threat to nesting success. That picture on the bottom is your typical urban structure to send the water off the land as quickly as possible. And that's what's happened to a lot of rivers across this country, is essentially the channelization of concrete structures. So we have barriers to wildlife movement, and in a warming climate, it's a whole other speech that I oftentimes give. Wildlife movement is the future to wildlife conservation. Wildlife movement is always important, even before climate change. Once you put climate change into a factor, when you look at these climate envelopes shifting steadily northward toward the poles, where today's climate is not going to be suitable for wildlife in the future. It's going to have shifted northwards. So we need to, as a general proposition, accelerate our strategy for facilitating wildlife movement in this country. You put up these structures, that makes it that much more difficult. So major barrier to wildlife movement, which is a significant imperative. You also have the general problem of the more you're able to facilitate construction on coasts and in floodplains, you're spreading out development as opposed to doing what we need to do to limit habitat destruction and limit water quality and protect water quality. We need to make development more dense and more compact communities. And finally, subject of another talk, but the critical importance of delta wetlands. Right now, if you look at coastal Louisiana, an issue that my colleague David is working on, you're losing about a football field size of land a year in coastal Louisiana. Is it day? Hour. Thank you, David. Got to work on that soundbite. Massive amount of land loss in coastal Louisiana and in places like the Mekong Delta and around the world due to river channelization, where you prevent that natural spreading out of the river to deposit of sediment. And so many reasons why this hard infrastructure around the planet is causing problems for wildlife. One of the things in my talks here today is if we start implementing a green infrastructure approach, we're going to get a triple win. The third part of the win here is for taxpayers. And loss of wildlife gets people really pissed off. Stealing their money and raising their taxes really pisses people off. And so I want to talk to you about one of the great injustices that's happening in our tax system right now, where we, everyday taxpayers, are subsidizing decisions by people to build in hazardous locations. There are many, many examples of this. An area that I've been working a lot in is the National Flood Insurance Program, which is right now roughly $30 billion in debt. Now, how do you have a federal program that's in debt? It was designed to be actuarially sound. In other words, the claims are supposed to match the premiums. But in fact, they have been masking the risk, over the years, keeping the premiums low, and effectively subsidizing people who want to build the most hazardous location and paying them to move back in again. And so we, the taxpayers, are going to be footing that bill. And disaster relief has been a significant expense to the Treasury. It's only going to go up in the world of climate change. The recent package that was passed just this January to help with Hurricane Sandy recovery was at $50 billion. That's going to become increasingly the norm. Now, why is that so expensive? If you have a bunch of structures that are essentially built in hazardous places, not resilient to intense storms and floods, it gets much more costly to have to repair and recover. So, again, my focus in my talk in terms of what the solution is to this gigantic problem is that we have an opportunity to really achieve a number of goals at once, and moving policy forward successfully, in my experience, is looking at bringing different interests together in a common cause. So here the common cause is we want to limit, starting at the top. The common cause is we all want to help wildlife. We all recognize there's a lot of communities who are vulnerable to floods and storms. We need to help them figure out how to address those threats. And finally, we need to begin to end these taxpayer ripoffs. What I'm going to do for the rest of my talk is to walk through what I would consider the key to any sort of successful biodiversity conservation strategy when you're sitting in a lawyer's seat. And that is, you need good regulations. And that could range from federal environmental laws like the Endangered Species Act, and I'm going to walk you through some examples of how to use that, all the way down to your local land use codes and zoning and building codes. Smarter plans. Every single dollar that is spent by the government has to be fed into some plan. And most of the plans that are out there are written behind the scenes without significant engagement by people like you. There's all kinds of opportunities to essentially drive policy by getting to these planning processes. And particularly in this area of hazard mitigation and disaster recovery, which has generally not been a forum where conservation interests have been represented. Finally, subsidies, and this is the big one. It's always the most challenging because one of the reasons why there's so many lobbyists parked up there in Washington, D.C. is that it's the business model of many industries to ensure that they're well protected by subsidies. And those subsidies have generally supported that notion I talked about before, which is facilitating development of lots of hard infrastructure, masking the risks of flood and storm. So how can we shift those subsidies both toward a green infrastructure approach and building more resilient communities that are necessarily going to be experiencing floods and storms but are more able to withstand them? All that needs to be done in a climate-smart way. And this notion of climate change adaptation is really more than just mouthing the words climate change. There actually is a discipline that's evolving in terms of how you actually look at climate science and apply it to all these things, regulation, planning, and subsidies. It's about doing assessments of the vulnerability of your various assets, laying out the options, basically having really intelligent understanding about what the climate models are saying, and looking for those sort of mid-scenario things that you can plan around. You're not going to plan necessarily for the worst-case scenario because that's extremely expensive and inconvenient, but nor do you want to necessarily plan for the rosy scenario. So you facilitate some kind of process for weighing what the risks are, weighing what your options are. And that's becoming a very established area of legal practice as well as a practice of land use planners. I think it's really helpful to become knowledgeable about. All right, so we don't have time to go through all the regulatory opportunities for essentially facilitating this agenda of green infrastructure, but I do want to talk about the Endangered Species Act because that's one that I have been very active in my career, and it's a law that I feel very strongly about. I think it's really one of the great moral statements ever made by our federal government. Essentially say we want to keep all these other species around with us was truly significant when that law was passed in the early 1970s. The key point I want to make here is it's a law that fosters a lot of creativity to solve problems that have been extremely vexing and difficult to get resolved. And the reason is because it has a real strong regulatory push, and those regulations are grounded in science. Essentially, you can't jeopardize the existence of a listed species. And so what jeopardy is something that's determined by hard science. It's not somebody arbitrarily, from a political perspective, deciding what the bottom line is. It also, though, has a lot of flexible tools in it for bringing different stakeholders to the table. And so these pictures up here of the grizzly bear, and we have essentially recovered the Yellowstone grizzly bear, major endangered species success story. And that is because you had that hard regulatory push, and yet some tools were created to bring really divergent stakeholders to the table to get that issue resolved. Similarly, with a lot of the major land use problems that have plagued the Pacific Northwest, getting much closer to resolution thanks to the listing of the Pacific salmon. And that's a picture of the golden chief warbler. In conservative Texas, we have some of the most innovative habitat conservation planning driven by the listing of the golden chief warbler. So I want to talk about a local example. A case that I worked on with my colleague David sitting over here. When I arrived at the National Wildlife Federation in 1994, David had won round one of this multi-decadal piece of litigation. And that was a ruling by the Southern District of Florida that essentially said that FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, that's the agency that runs our National Flood Insurance Program, said by issuing that flood insurance, they were encouraging development in the habitat of the endangered key deer, and as a result of facilitating that development, you are essentially carrying out an action that has an impact on the listed species. Because you're having an impact on a listed species with your program, you have to do a consultation with the expert wildlife agency, the Fish and Wildlife Service. Now, why is that significant? I'll talk about in just a moment, but you have an agency that never considered itself to be a wildlife agency, never considered itself any remote responsibility for wildlife, now having to talk to a wildlife agency that has a significant club in its back pocket, this protection against jeopardizing listed species. Well, when David left the NWF in 1995, I became lead counsel. I was lead counsel in this case for the next couple of decades. And one of the most significant things we secured was a ruling by the Fish and Wildlife Service called a biological opinion that essentially found that there was a jeopardy situation. One of the rare instances where the Fish and Wildlife Service pulled out its big club and said, you are jeopardizing not just the endangered Florida key deer, but 8 other listed terrestrial species in the Keys. That forced FEMA to the table to look at its entire flood insurance program in the Keys and say, what are we going to do differently now in light of the land use impacts of this program? Well, unfortunately, they couldn't really stomach doing anything all that differently. So they cooked up what I would call a paper-pushing solution. Didn't really change the way things were operating on the ground, so we went back to court. Long story short, we won another very favorable court ruling, throwing out their bogus solution and issuing an injunction, again, another first, enjoining all FEMA-facilitated development in endangered species habitat in the Florida Keys. That shook things up quite a bit, both locally and nationally, with this program. So let me talk to you about what the implications of this litigation is, because it's really, I think, a little bit of a case study, not just on how to get this Nosebin green infrastructure ensconced into policy, but also just about some observations about impact litigation. Here you had an agency that basically was in denial that its program had any impact on the choice of where it built. And now we have an agency that has officials like a federal judge and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service saying, you are wrong. So people from the outside of the program will step in and completely revolutionize a program that had been around for many years. Before that, they had only focused on how we're going to make resilient structures more resilient. So if you have a home in the Keys, if you want insurance, you can't have a basement, you can't have a below-level enclosure. Or maybe in some cases elsewhere they might say you have to elevate the structure. Well, that's all well and good. It doesn't do a lot for listed species if you're knocking down their habitat and building that home. And the science is showing that for many, many floods and storms, that's just not going to cut it for protecting people either. So now we have a new paradigm suddenly arriving on the laps of FEMA saying you need to start looking at green infrastructure solutions as well as floods. So that is huge. Now, what have we got actually ensconced into policy? I am not going to overstate what FEMA has done because they have been dragged kicking and screaming. They did make a significant change to one of their policy guidances that basically said on the sort of non-mandatory part of the program called the community rating system, essentially a voluntary program, you get extra credits for entering in habitat conservation plans. So there is halting acknowledgement of this land use connection. And there are communities that can now benefit from really being proactive about endangered species. In Monroe County, what we had, which is generally not the case in most other places in the country, is a very aggressive limits on building, primarily for evacuation reasons. And so they basically adopted those limits in building into their new biological opinion. Now, how many other places will that be replicated? So in that aspect of the situation, it's not clear that we have a huge precedent based on that on-the-ground solution. And as an example of that, we've been trying to extend this precedent around the country. We've been filing essentially copycat lawsuits to essentially get FEMA to acknowledge it's having an impact on endangered species all around the country. So 2 places we have filed cases. One is up in Seattle to protect the Puget Sound Chinook salmon as well as the killer whale, the orca, that feeds on the salmon. We won that case, essentially got a judge to say, FEMA, you must consult with the Wildlife Agency, in that case is NOAA, about the impacts of your program. And we took another step, what I think is one of the best biological opinions I've ever seen written on the History of the Endangered Species Act, written by a NOAA biologist. For some reason, managed to get this thing out the door without any political interference. That essentially acknowledges the existence of climate change, tells the local governments who are all participating in this program, you have to revise your land use codes and deal with this land use issue. We are now getting ready, we are back in court because the local governments have not wanted to adhere to that, and NOAA and FEMA are running scared and don't want to force them into doing anything. And so this is halting progress. This is our world as litigators. And similarly, in this state, we came back for more to protect the listed sea turtles on the beaches of Florida. It's a case that essentially forced the FEMA to deal with the impacts of its subsidies on the habitats of the loggerhead sea turtle and all the other coastal species of Florida. And FEMA can hardly disagree that their program was having an impact. And so they settled the case without us getting a ruling. But we still don't have the biological opinion that will change policy. They're still in consultation. So if any of you are looking for things to do in your free time as environmental activists, call up your neighboring FEMA and Fish and Wildlife Service and ask what happened. Because it's still sitting. I'm sure they're actively working on myself. So, how many of you remember the cartoon Tom and Jerry? So this is the world of the litigator, and probably extends well beyond environmental litigation. It is a little bit of a cat and mouse game. If you have, particularly a government agency that doesn't want to do what you're trying to get them to do, what we call impact litigation, you only have so many tools in your toolbox. And typically the response from judges is, I'm going to tell them to go back and do it right. And we have a lot of great court rulings where judges tell the agency to go back and do it right. And so in this case, we have this wonderful sweeping language in these rulings. I'm really proud of the things we've achieved in these court precedents, and people are citing them left and right. We have, for the first time, really great language out of the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals. It says FEMA has to develop a real conservation program under Section 7A1 of the Endangered Species Act, a long-neglected provision of the law. We have gotten those small policy changes I was talking about. We've gotten some great conversation going on. But in terms of major policy impact, in terms of putting out a whole new set of regulations and changing the world, it is really hard to do the way our legal system is set up. The litigation by itself, I'm going to caution all of you, is only going to get you so far. So it's very resource intensive and time consuming. I'm not regretting any of the many hours I spent over 20 years in the case, but by itself did not really shift the fundamental incentives we have in this country that are set up to encourage people to build on coasts and in floodplains. And so to me, if you're going to have a successful litigation strategy, it has to be nested into a larger strategy on the politics and on the economics. So I want to talk to you a little bit about the politics of this issue. We have been working on Capitol Hill for a number of years on reforming the flood insurance program, and we have great news to report from last year. The two individuals you see on the right here, that's Judy Biggers, a Republican from Illinois, and that's Maxine Waters, a Democrat from California. And we successfully passed last year the Biggert-Waters Flood Insurance Reform Act of 2012. And here, these bullets are a quick summary of the major accomplishments. One is this whole subsidy of development in these hazardous locations is beginning to shift. And you might have been reading about it. I've been noticing in the Tampa Bay Times, it's a daily story. I'm being to maybe in the question and answer part of this, we can get into what this means for all of you and how we're going to deal with it. But the bottom line is that Congress recognized that it was digging a hole and deeper, this $30 billion